What I'm reading today, yes, it's in Australian. It's in Australian, so you'll have to organise your brain around that and not expect King James language. Psalm 22. This is the second part of Psalm 22. Probably later into the Easter season, we'll get to read or listen to the first part. But this part is a song of celebration. Psalm 22, verses 23 to 31. Lord, I call on all who honour you to stand up and say so. All who trace their roots to Jacob will give you the glory. All who share the heritage of Israel will stand in awe of you. Lord, you did not rubbish anyone or blame the victims for their suffering. You did not turn away or slip off quietly. When I cried for help, you responded. Whenever my people gathered to worship, my heart overflows and I sing your praises. Out in the open for all to see, I'll do all that I promised. At your table, God, the needy will feast. Those who hunger for you will be fed until they burst with praise. They'll be able to live it up now and forever. In every corner of the earth, the people will wake up to themselves and turn back to you, Lord. Every race, nation, tribe and family will offer themselves to you in worship. For you have the last word on everything. For you say what goes. Even the dead will bow down to you, Lord. Those who are trampled in the dust will look to you in hope. And I will live for you and you alone. Our kids and their kids will serve you, Lord, as we pass the message down from one generation to the next. People not even born yet will hear the story. They will be told of what you have done to set us free. Next reading, Mark chapter 8, verses 31 to 38. Once his followers had identified him as the Messiah, Jesus began to fill them in on what was going to happen to him. The new human is going to be put through the ringer. He'll be done over by the politicians, the priests, and the religious lawyers. They'll have him executed. But after 3 days, he'll rise to life. He didn't beat about the bush on this. He spelled it out as clear as you like. But Peter would have none of it. He pulled Jesus aside and gave him a piece of his mind. Recognizing that his followers were losing the plot, Jesus made an example of Peter, saying, "Get out of my face, you Satan. You've got no idea what God is on about. You're just pursuing the same things as everyone else." Then he called everyone to gather round, his followers and the whole crowd, and he said to them, "Anyone who intends to come with me has to hand over the keys, sign their own death warrant, and then do as I do. If you try to hold on to control of your life, you'll end up losing the lot. But if you let go, even if you pay the ultimate price for your commitment to me and to our message, you'll gain real life. What's the point of getting control of the whole world if getting it kills you? There's no trade-in on a burned out soul. There are some who find it embarrassing to be associated with me and with what I'm on about when they're hanging around with their deceitful and easily distracted peers. If they don't sort themselves out, they'll find that when the new human arrives, full of the glory of God and surrounded by the angels, he'll be too embarrassed to associate with them. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
Named my sermon this week, and I don't think I actually finished on that one. I think it was more about finding our courage. It's an interesting reading. What do you guys make of this reading when you come up against take up your cross and follow me? You must deny yourself. You swallow hard and look for another reading. That's certainly one temptation from a preacher's perspective, I can tell you. But yeah, sacrifices, yeah. That's one way. That's certainly one way of looking at it. But you can really understand Peter's dismay. Peter so often speaks for us, doesn't he, in the Bible readings? He certainly, I reckon, speaks for the other disciples. I can just imagine they're all gathered around after, Jesus has said that, hey, you guys, I've got to let you know that I've been doing all this wonderful healing and stuff. You've just named me the Messiah, and yes, I am, but that means I've actually got to die and suffer. And I don't know that they heard the part that says I'm going to rise again in 3 days, and maybe they don't believe it. But either way, it's a real what the moment, I think, in modern parlance. What on earth are you on about, Jesus? And so the disciples probably gather in and say, Peter, go and tell Jesus that this is really not on. This is not what we signed up for and not what we thought you were about. You're about, you've been doing all this wonderful magic things and miracles and healing people, and you've been promising this new reign. So you're going to have to follow through on that. You're going to have to, become the sort of Messiah that we want you to be and expect you to be. And then comes one of the strongest little things that Jesus says to anyone, which is in the Revised Standard. I'll go King James for Angelica today. Get thee behind me, Satan. Yeah, how's that for? That's strong. And I'm pretty sure Jesus actually meant it to be strong, especially the Satan bit. The get thee behind me. Well, again, I just want to put in a bit about the language of that, because the same language that is used in the Greek for the get behind me as Jesus uses when he calls the disciples at the beginning of the gospel. So it's the same language. Follow me. Don't try and get in front of me. Follow me in what I do. And Peter's actually trying to do the opposite. He's trying to say to Jesus, actually, you've got it wrong. Jesus doesn't take that too well.
He doesn't have a lot of empathy then, does he?
Jesus doesn't.
In that instance.
No.
No, he doesn't say like, well, Peter, I understand why you're afraid. Maybe we can talk about it.
Yeah. Yeah. Come and sit down and have a cappuccino and we'll talk it through. Yeah. No, you're right. I mean, that could have been a more helpful and, way of moving on. But it is what it is. And sorry, Jane.
I think there's a point. I don't think Jesus always knew what the outcome was going to be. And I think he was born in that manger that I see so often in European paintings, think none of he was God. And I think there's a point at which he must have realised that the challenge he was posing established authorities was going to lead to a very bad outcome for himself. And I think it's a statement of his own fear, his own temptation to compromise and not to go through with what he's challenged.
Yeah. Yeah, so if we take in, that's very true. I think if we take into account a whole Jesus rather than the serene, gentle Jesus, meek and mild, that we have taken into ourselves, with growing up in the church. If we see Jesus as this fully human individual as well as fully divine, then sure, when it does occur to him, as I believe there is an instance of awareness in Jesus, then this is not an easy thing for him to have told his disciples that, I sort of see the transition this way. Jesus came into his ministry. He has an awareness that he has a divine place, and he sets out doing the sort of things that are godlike things. When he sees pain, when he sees alienation, he tries to heal it. When he sees sickness, he tries to heal it and bring new life. He tries to point people to a new way that's a different way, not of violence and hatred, but of love and compassion. And then he knows somewhere in there, if I keep doing this in this way, that's where it's going to end, because you come up against the powers that be and people aren't comfortable with that to the extreme, and you'll be faced with violence and death. And so, yeah, when he has the people that he loves and trusts the closest, not understanding his pain and his distress, you can understand a snap in that moment, I think.
That does make him fully human, doesn't it?
Yeah, yeah.
Well, the scene in the Garden of Gethsemane sort of struck me as a man who was profoundly distressed at the human being in what he had triggered. But then on the other hand, he constantly triggers it. I mean, presumably this is before he goes into Jerusalem.
Yeah.
And I mean, going into Jerusalem the way he did was a profound provocation for the Jewish authorities.
He was walking into the lion's mouth, sort of thing, and saying, "Bite me." But he went there not, so I think, just to produce the provocation, but because that's where the heart of the faith was, and that's where he believed he was meant to be.
I think it makes me think of Alexander Navalny. There's a point where you know that the end of the road is death, and there's a point where you keep walking or you fall back into the crowd. And Peter was tempting Jesus to come back into the crowd and not keep walking forward. And the people that keep walking are the ones that go into history, like Dietrich Bonhoeffer stood up against the Germans, Joan of Arc. When it comes to that fear, they keep walking.
Yeah. Sue and I went to see a movie called One Life, if anybody's seen that. We saw it yesterday. It's about a guy called Nicholas Winton, who was a stockbroker in England, nice and safe at the beginning of the Second World War. It tells his life story. Beautifully done, I think. And at some point, before the war started, he decides to visit Czechoslovakia just for a week. Hitler's taken over a few countries and is just heading towards Czechoslovakia. There's hundreds of children he sees and families in poverty, and his response is to try and get the children out. And when everybody else says it's impossible, there's all these barriers in front of it, he just says, and there's a quote that I can remember part of. I wish I'd written it down, but you can't really do that in the middle of a movie. But he says, when people ask him, why are you doing this? And he doesn't do it alone. He does it with the help of his mother back in England, and he does it with the help of a whole lot of people, some of whom died for it. He says to them, what I have seen, I cannot unsee. And I felt like that was that's part of the story that what we're reading about today. Jesus, none of the gospel is in isolation when we read it, is it? It's part of the whole story. And the whole story here is that Jesus has come into his ministry. He's seen people in need. He's seen people suffering. And it's important to remember the response to that suffering. It is that old, come unto me, all who are weak and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. You know, so Jesus' response to suffering is not to turn away, but to look more fully and more deeply into it. And it's part of that looking more deeply that he realizes that where the road is going. And he calls his disciples into that same path, I guess, with a realization that sometimes when you stand up against hatred and bigotry and violence, then you'll come onto the end of that yourself. So I reckon Jesus was inviting us to live as he lived, seeing the pain of the world and responding with love. That's what this Take Up My Cross, I think, is about. Seeing the pain of the world and responding with love. He wasn't inviting us into a life of self-denial that strips all life of all pleasure, celebration, or joy. I don't believe that's what Jesus meant either. I can't recognise it in the Jesus who played with children, who turned water into wine, or the Jesus who really dwelt with the outcast. It is important when preachers like me stand up and talk about taking up your cross to remember that Jesus also said, come to me, you who are weak and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. We have a many-hued gospel addressing different situations. I think Jesus invites us like, the book's gone.
I sent it to-
I sent it out to Jonathan. Excellent. Mavis the Bravest invites us to have the courage where we can. And I actually think that when Jesus says, get thee behind me, Satan, you know, stop doing this to Peter, he's inviting Peter to have the courage to face the hard stuff, but to continue to face the pain of the world, to face down death and violence. To take up a cross, as Jesus did, is to stand in the hot white centre of the world's pain, to identify ourselves with those who are aching, weeping, screaming, and dying. Taking up the cross means recognising Christ crucified in every suffering soul and body that surrounds us, and pouring our energies and our lives into alleviating that pain. But it's also important to recognise that we can't take the weight of all that pain on our shoulders alone, but we have to trust some of it into the presence of the crucified God. And it is easy to feel that we can do nothing in the face of this enormity. The enormity, like, you know, you could name, what are the crosses that we bear? What's the stuff we see that we can't unsee? For me, it's the stuff in Palestine, a lot of it at the moment.
For me, it's, we're on the pathway to another resurrection of the hatred of immigrants and both people.
Yeah,
That's going to be part of the next election.
yeah. So we can't.
And,
Yes.
we have a government that pursues one of the harshest policies in the world.
Yeah.
And we feel that we can't change it because it capitalizes on fear.
So that's exactly right. So that's a cross that we see and we can't unsee. And in some ways we're called to have the courage to continue to face it, even when it feels, you know, just too big. Yeah. We can't seemingly stop the injustice surrounding asylum seekers. That was the next thing I had written down, Joan. But we can care and we can act. We can't stop the war in Gaza, but we can lift our voice when given the chance. We can't do it all, but I really believe that every little act of kindness, mercy, and love is an act of courage in the face of death and darkness. So my invitation for us this Lent is to take courage and face the world's pain, not with a sense that we can end it ourselves, but out of a sense that this is where Jesus is, and this is what and who Jesus cares for. There is a kind of facing that disempowers us and is somehow feeding off the pain of the world, but the kind of facing, the kind of taking up the cross that Jesus was talking about, I reckon, is that we are called to face down the powers of violence and death and facing this pain with love, with grace, and with hope, because this is where God dwells. Amen. That's just a quote from a movie yesterday. I work on the motto that if something's not impossible, there must be a way of doing it. Inspiring movie if you get a chance to watch it, just by the way.